So you want to be a mechanist. You've seen these crazy machines that people are building with the Create mod and you want to get in on it. But you just don't know how. Over the next few episodes, I'll be taking you step by step through all of the mechanics of Create that you'll need to build whatever wacky contraption you can come up with. First, we'll be looking at my personal favorite part of the Create mod, and that is the moving parts. I'll explain the 3 different types of moving contraptions as well as building with chassis. The first form of motion is the linear device. This includes both types of mechanical pistons and the rope pulley. Everyone knows the vanilla piston. The mechanical piston is like the piston's big brother. And just like the normal piston, there are regular and sticky varieties. They're powered by rotational force, which we'll get into in another episode. And they change direction based on the rotation of the directional force. This right here is a gear shift, and that changes, and when it receives a redstone signal, it changes the direction that it's spinning. You can see the little rod in here spinning. When I flip that, it changes direction, and it pulls the piston back. Mechanical pistons have 3 modes. Always place when stopped, only place in starting position, and place only when the anchor destroyed. The anchor, of course, being the piston itself. Most of the time you'll be using it either in always place when stopped or place only in starting position. I haven't personally found any use for this 3rd mode, but I'm sure there's something out there. Mechanical pistons also need piston extension pulls, and they can use up to 64 of them. See, this one here has 64 pulls. I'd count them all, but thanks to the engineer's goggles, I can see exactly how many there are just by looking at it. And you can see that it works. But if I take one, and simply by right-clicking on the one at the base, it'll add one to the end of it. That changes it to 65, and it will no longer move. Pistons can be placed facing any direction and will automatically stick to their extension poles if moved. So if I were to move this piston with, say, a sticky variety, in fact, let's go ahead and do that now. When you place it down, you can hold shift and it'll place facing away from you. If you don't hold shift, it'll face placing towards you. So place it away from me, and we will just get a hand crank, crank it out, pull it back, and it pulls the extension poles with it. The rope pulley is like a mechanical piston, except it only drops its rope straight down. This is good for elevators and mining machines and things of that sort. It makes up for this in other ways, though. It can go down up to 128 blocks rather than the 64 of the piston, and it doesn't require piston extension arms either. All of these linear devices will get stuck on blocks. So for example, if I were to place chassis like this so that they're connected and extend this out, you can see that it gets stopped on that block. It also moves entities around. So you saw, well, when I pushed it out, it moved me along with it. Normally, contraptions can move 2,048 blocks. However, I've found a little discrepancy with that. I found that pistons can push and pull 2,046 blocks, whereas the rope pulley can push and pull 2,050 blocks. I'm pretty sure that this is a bug, but I figured I'd put it in the video anyway. The second form of motion is the rotational device. This includes the mechanical bearing, the windmill bearing, and also the clockwork bearing. The mechanical bearing, when powered and activated, will rotate all the blocks attached to it. You can activate it simply by right-clicking, and deactivate it also by right-clicking. It will rotate all of the blocks attached to it along the axis that it is facing. Now this has 3 modes. Always place when stopped, only place near initial angle, and place only when anchor destroyed. Similar to the piston, but, with a circular motion. If another mechanical bearing, so if I take one of these, place it on here, and just attach some linear chassis there, we'll get an interesting effect. It'll follow the motion of the device, but it won't rotate itself. This is good for things like Ferris wheels and circular elevators of the sort. The windmill bearing is almost exactly like the mechanical bearing, except that it doesn't take in power, but instead, it's a power source. As long as it has a wool block, a sail, or a sail frame on it, then it will rotate under its own power. It has 2 modes, clockwise rotation and counterclockwise rotation. Pretty simple. We'll talk more about it in our episode about power generation. The third type of rotational device is the clockwork bearing. When powered, this bearing acts as an in-game clock, rotating 2 structures in front of it to point to the in-game time, like clock hands. It has 3 modes. Hour hand first, minute hand first, or 24-hour hand first. Of all the rotational devices, I find this one to be the most niche. It doesn't really have a good use outside of being a clock, and any use that it could be used for is better done with either a mechanical bearing or a windmill bearing. Rotational devices will move entities, but they are not stopped by a block being in the way. So, for example, let's say I were to put a piece of wool right there. Right-click on that, and it'll simply phase through the block of wool. However, it will push me around all day long. The third and final form of motion is the minecart device. You place a cart assembler on top of a piece of rail and build your structure around it. When a cart assembler gets a redstone signal, it'll attach the blocks on top and to either side of it to the first minecart that goes underneath. The only exception, of course, being the lever that powers it. And now this is attached to the minecart. And it detaches from the first cart assembler it goes under that is unpowered. There are some more niche rules about this that I'm not entirely familiar with. Take this structure, turn it sideways, and attach it to a second cart assembler. Put a minecart under each end. Look at that. It attaches to both of them. And now it'll use the 2 carts as a pivot point. Oh. My bad. Yes, it'll use the 2 carts as a pivot point. And you can see as it goes around this corner here, it rotates smoothly around. Now it's not going to break if it falls off of rails, but it will make it very hard to work with. Minecart devices also do not interact with outside blocks, but they do push entities. You can build minecart assemblies on top of regular minecarts, minecarts with chests, and minecarts with furnaces. However, you cannot make them on top of TNT minecarts or hopper minecarts. These contraptions can be moved either by powered rail, or this actually adds a good use for the minecart with a furnace. Cart assemblies can also be hooked up to other minecarts via the minecart coupling added by Create. This can be used potentially to hook up an existing contraption to a minecart with a furnace. The cart assembler has 3 different modes. Always face towards motion, pause actors while rotating, and lock rotation. I'm honestly not entirely sure what pause actors while rotating does. It might be just a singular minecart thing, and I've played mostly with the dual minecart system. But the always face towards, the lock rotation setting will keep your minecarts from randomly turning around if your carts happen to go in the other direction. The minecart device can go wherever rail can go. So if a rail can do it, so can a minecart device. It can go up. It can go down. It can go around corners. And the minecart device can also fall off the end of a rail and onto another rail. Basically anything a minecart can do, a minecart contraption can do, with some added benefits from the dual minecart system and from the connectors. Now that we know how to move things, we need something for it to move. Well, there are 2 types of chassis, linear and radial. The linear chassis will automatically connect to neighboring chassis of the same orientation. So this one is facing towards me here, and it automatically connects to any other neighboring chassis that are facing the same direction. And all the connected chassis will move together. But if I were to place one at that angle, it's not going to connect to that. If you place a chassis onto another chassis, it will mimic that chassis' orientation. So no matter how I place these on this face here, it's still going to place them the same direction. Now that's not going to connect automatically. To do that, we need to use this. By right-clicking with a slime ball or super glue onto a linear chassis, we will make it sticky. Right-clicking it a second time will make the other face sticky. And to make it unsticky, you merely have to shift right-click it. This will allow you to connect up to 16 blocks going out in that direction, which is configurable by using a wrench, hovering over this box here, and using your scroll wheel to extend it out by scrolling up, or draw it back in by scrolling down. We'll bring it up to 8 for demonstration purposes. And now, when I turn the crank, it moves that piece of chassis along with it. And it'll do up to 8 blocks. By hovering over this with the wrench, it'll outline all the blocks that it connects to. But it's not going to outline the blocks that this one is connected to. So now that I've got it connected to all of those, moves that, and brings it back down. Now if I remove this piece, however, that block is not connected to the contraption anymore and will not be moved with it. Now changing these chassis one at a time can be time consuming. So if you hold down the control key, you can change all of the connected chassis at the same time simply by scrolling once. Pretty neat. There's also another linear chassis here, the secondary linear chassis. It acts exactly the same as the original linear chassis, but you can see here it doesn't connect directly side to side. This can be useful for the really tight builds. The radial chassis, however, connect more like logs. So you see all that? Connects perfectly well, comes back down. And that's the only way they connect to each other. However, by using a slime ball or glue on the side of it, I can connect objects within its radius. By default, that's also 8 for this. Again, using control, I can change that radius on all of the radial chassis. When connecting blocks to a radial chassis, the only requirement is it's either touching a face with the slime on it, or it's touching a block that is touching the face, or it's touching a block that's touching a block that's touching the face, and so forth and so forth. You will see that all of these blocks move, even though only one is touching the face with the slime on it. However, again, if I were to break one block, everything past that block does not move when the piston moves the radial chassis. Now this radial chassis is only at 8. You can imagine how big of an area it'll do with 16 blocks. And in case you're wondering, it does do a circle and not a square. So this little corner here, that's what it does by itself. The final way to connect a structure together is with superglue. When right-clicked on the face of a block, it leaves some slime there. Then you place your next piece onto that, and it moves. But it only works for one block. So you have to do it for each and every one that you want, making it really inefficient. And you can see it's still there. It sticks around in between these two blocks because it's an entity, which is also part of its biggest problem. Superglue is fine for smaller applications like this, but if I were to build a giant device, like let's say I was testing the push limit of a piston, if I did all this with superglue, it would probably crash my world because that's just so many entities. But for smaller applications like this, it's not going to cause too many problems. I find personally that it works best to rely mostly on linear chassis and radial chassis, but occasionally there's this one block that you can't really reach with a chassis, and that's where the superglue really works the best. I haven't had many of those instances, but it's there in case you need it. Well, that's it for our first lesson. Next week I'll go everything about power generation, speed, and stress. If you learned something, be sure to give the video a like, and subscribe to catch the next lesson when it comes out. Until next time, stay creative.